From bureaus worldwide, this is FSN.
Cheers, Ollie. Some sick puppies around putting needles and stuff into strawberries, eh? Some sick puppies. Welcome to Monday's programme, the 17th of September 2018. My name is Richie Allen, welcoming our listeners joining us on Fab Radio 2, TuneIn Radio, triggerwarning.tv, Cogent Radio app, and everywhere else.
Welcome back to the most listened to independent radio show in Europe. It's your Richie Allen Show. It's the Richie Allen Show. Broadcasting live on richieallen.co.uk and multiple platforms around the world. And now, here's your host, Richie Allen.
Hope you've had a good weekend. Tweet at Richie Allen Show with any comments during the programme. Dr. Chris Busby joins the programme this hour. He's a scientist and an expert on the health effects of ionizing radiation. I first came across him many years ago when he co-authored a study about the rise in infant mortality and cancer in Fallujah, which of course was carpet bombed by the US in 2004. He was arrested last week. Well, he was taken into custody, where he spent many hours. Bizarre story. It really is. Many of his followers and supporters believe it is because he occasionally speaks to RT, Russia Today television, about security matters, and he has been speaking to them about the Skripal Salisbury affair. So Dr. Chris Busby joins this programme this hour, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with Tom Quiggin in the second hour of the programme. Tom's an intelligence expert. He's a broadcaster, and he co-authored a very interesting book about political Islam, and we're going to dig down into that with Tom in the second hour. He'll be live from Ottawa in Canada. Interesting programme I think I've got for you today. As I said, Monday. It's the day everybody hates, except me, because my days are the same. It doesn't matter. Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Tuesday, doesn't matter to me. Anyway, I'm going to jump straight into a couple of stories because time will be pressing on today's show. So it will. Now, Brexit, just briefly. I'm giving you less and less doses of Brexit lately. But just wanted to point out that the International Monetary Fund, in the guise of Christine Lagarde, of course, has warned that a no-deal Brexit on World Trade Organization terms would entail substantial costs for the UK economy. Now, Lagarde and the IMF is part of the Troika, the unholy alliance that is the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Union itself. These are the scarecrows and the skeletons and the Muppets who said 2 years ago, before the referendum, that if we did vote to leave, the economy would collapse within days. And it didn't. So the IMF said that all likely Brexit scenarios would be bad for the UK. Whether we do a deal or not, whether we're in an European economic area or not, whether we go to World Trade Organization terms or not, it's all going to be bad. The challenges in getting a deal done were daunting, said Christine Lagarde. Do you want to hear just a smidgen of what she had to say today? She's like impending death. Here's Christine Lagarde.
Let me be clear.
Massive light coming up when you hear, let me be clear. Prepare yourself for the Pinocchio-esque moment when her nose will expand by several inches. Let me be clear, what, love?
Compared with today's smooth single market, all the likely Brexit scenarios will have costs for the UK economy,
dun, dun, dun,
and to a lesser extent as well for the EU.
To a lesser extent, the EU, she said. Now, when she said that, the blue fairy keeled over stone dead again. Because the UK buys more. The European Union sells more to the UK than the UK sells to the EU. Said this 1,000 times. We have nothing to fear. But anyway, let's not stop the lies.
The larger the impediments to trade in the new relationship, the costlier it will be.
Yeah. Anyway, Chancellor of the Exchequer Philip Hammond Theresa May's pal, a Remainer. What did he have to say? He was with Lagarde. Philip Hammond.
A no-deal scenario remains unlikely, but it is not impossible. We've released a number of technical notices setting out what citizens and businesses would need to do in the case of no deal, with more to come in the coming weeks. The IMF are clear today that no deal would be extremely costly for the UK, as it would also for the EU.
That's not what she said, though. She said to a lesser extent, the European Union would suffer. To a lesser extent, she said, which was a lie. Of course, you know that, Hammond. You know the EU sells more into the UK than vice versa.
And that despite the contingency actions we're taking, leaving without a deal would put at risk the substantial progress the British people have made over the past 10 years in repairing our economy.
Yeah, what a weasel he is. The fix is in. And we know this because Brussels is now saying that they are warming, or it is warming, to Theresa May's Chequers plan. Of course they are, because Theresa May's plan, as pointed out by Jacob Rees-Mogg and others, effectively keeps the UK in the EU, except in name. The Chequers plan pretends the country has left, but it hasn't. It's signed up to the EU rules and regulations on trade, on movement and everything else. I've said this 1,000 times. Let's leave Brexit alone today. Aren't I good? Aren't I decent, as we say in the old country, not to be bombarding you with Brexit? This is kind of interesting, even though it's pure theatre, I think. A number of Republicans, you may have heard Ollie Barrett mention this in the news, number of Republicans have said that the vote on the President Trump, on his Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh should be paused. Why? Well, because allegations of sexual assault have been made against Brett Kavanaugh. You might have seen this over the weekend. So some Republicans are saying, let's suspend the vote, let's put it on hold for a while we find out if the man has behaved inappropriately. What's this all about? Well, a woman called Christine Blasey Ford accused Kavanaugh of attacking her in the very early 1980s. He denies it, and these allegations, they appeared in the Washington Post, I believe. I think they did. I have a note there somewhere. And only days before the Senate Judiciary Committee would vote on basically approving him and getting him onto the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh himself and Professor Ford say they would testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. White House advisor Kellyanne Conway said Ford should not be insulted or ignored and that she should testify under oath, although that would be up to the committee to decide. Here's Kellyanne Conway speaking on Fox and Friends earlier today.
Well, this woman should not be insulted and she should not be ignored. I think the Senate is headed to a reasonable approach, in that it seems to me, and speaking to a few senators, including Senator Lindsey Graham, that allowing this woman to be heard in sworn testimony, allowing Judge Kavanaugh to be heard in sworn testimony about these specific allegations would be added to the very considerable mountain of evidence and considerations that folks will have when they weigh whether or not to vote for Judge Kavanaugh to be on the Supreme Court. So let me make very clear, I've spoken with the President, I've spoken with Senator Graham and others. This woman will be heard. She's going to, I think the Senate Judiciary Committee will decide how and through which forum. In other words, will it be by telephone? Will it be in person?
Will it be on the telephone? Will it be on Skype? Will she be there in person? But she will be heard, said Kellyanne Conway. And she shouldn't be harassed and ridiculed. She should be heard. Conway then said that it must be pointed out that women are coming forward to support Kavanaugh. Old schoolmates, clerks, law school people, colleagues, etc. A lot of women, about 65, have come out to say they support him and that he never behaved inappropriately with them. Here's Kellyanne Conway again.
Remember, too, that has to be weighed against what we already know, which is that Judge Kavanaugh is a man of character and integrity who has been through 6 FBI vettings, which I can tell you firsthand are significant and thorough. He also has been lauded by women from every different aspect of his life. And this is significant. This is very significant for a man of character and integrity to be spoken about so highly by women who maybe didn't vote for President Trump, maybe don't call themselves Republicans, certainly. In fact, many who don't. But women who went to Yale with him, women who were taught with him at Harvard, his many female law clerks, the mothers of the young girls that he coaches in basketball here in a Washington, D.C. suburb.
Right, so a lot of women have come forward to say basketball, he coaches girls basketball, his former colleagues, fellow students have come forward to say that he's pretty much a good guy. She finished up by repeating that the accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, would get an opportunity to say what she wants to say, and that she should do so in an atmosphere of, pretty much an atmosphere of respect. So what's been alleged here then? Well, Christine Blasey Ford, the professor, wrote a letter to a Democrat back in the early summer, as far as I can tell, making this allegation against Brett Kavanaugh. The allegation that he sexually assaulted her more than 30 years ago. They were high school students in Maryland at the time. Now, she wanted this to be kept confidential, allegedly, but it wasn't kept confidential, and it has been put out there, and the Washington Post ran with the story. So now she says, does Professor Ford, well, if the story's got to be told, or if it is going to be told, well, I better be telling it. It should be me telling it now. Apparently one summer in the early 80s, Kavanaugh and a friend of his were pretty drunk, she alleges, remember, and that they corralled her into a bedroom during a gathering of teenagers at a house in Montgomery County. While friends watched, Kavanaugh pinned her to a bed and groped her over her clothes, grinding his body against hers and clumsily attempting to take her clothes off. When she tried to scream, she says he put his hand over her mouth. She said she thought he might inadvertently kill her at the time. She now works as a research psychologist in California. She says that he was attacking her and trying to remove her clothing. That's what she alleges. And apparently the first time she ever mentioned this was back in 2012 when in couples therapy with her husband. So what's going on? Well, I'll tell you what you won't get. And this is the media landscape we inhabit now. What you will never get is a definitive version of the truth, ever. Because on the one hand, you'll have the alt-right press saying she's a liar, that this is the latest in a long line of scandals, manufactured scandals designed to throw mud at Trump's presidency even, and embarrass him and make it difficult for him to carry out his job, to carry out a program of government. That's what they will say. That's what they are saying. She's a liar, she's a liar, she's a liar. And on the other hand, you have the lefty press, the alternative left, if you want to call it that, saying that it's probably true, she should be heard, the nomination should be put back. And as I said before, dear listener, and I will say it again, it's all theatre. It's all theatre. It is a scripted drama designed to get you wrapped up in it and gripped by it. Munching popcorn with your left hand, while in your right hand, your smartphone is there, and you're going on Twitter and you're having your say, and you're making your YouTube videos, and you're getting involved. It's engaging people in a process that people had been turning away from. It's amazing, really. 17 minutes past the hour. West Yorkshire Police, dear listener, has created a less revealing uniform for Muslim women, which is designed not to show the female form. West Yorkshire Police hopes that the looser fit will result in more ethnic minority recruits. Insert grown there. Apparently this uniform will come out and will fall straight down, and you won't see the female curves and the female form. Many forces already allow female officers to wear the hijab or the headscarf, but the new uniform is believed to be a UK first. How about, dear listener, and this is not a brand new idea now, it's not my idea, not mine, but how about opening recruitment to everybody, not making a big thing of it, and just accepting the outstanding candidates, whatever their background, eh? What about that? What about saying, listen, Anybody of the right age and of the right physical fitness can apply, and we will pick the best men and women for the job, irrespective of what they look like, whether they pray to Jesus or to Allah or to Jehovah or to Abba or to Barry Manilow or whomever they pray to. We'll just take the best. Simple, right? Rather than saying we need more of this group in the police. Remember that mad story from the summer? Do you remember that story? I nearly fell off my chair, Sunday View, early June. Do you remember when the BBC said that we now have 417 transgender staff, which we are very proud of? Now, that didn't make me laugh. That's fair enough. None of my business. If you got 417 out of 20,000, yeah, good job. Fair enough. No problem with that. Why shouldn't transgender folks work for the BBC? What made me laugh was when the BBC diversity chief, a man called Tunde Ogungbasan, when he said that there was a shortage of lesbians. We need more lesbians, he said at the time. How the hell could he manage that? Do you remember this? We have 417 transgenders. They're really proud of that. Good for you, Tunde. Well done, pal. Let's just leave it there. But no, he came out and he said, well, we have a shortage of lesbians. We've no lesbians, or not enough. How could you manage to increase your lesbian staff? How could you add more lesbians to the BBC production crew roster? How could you do that without breaking all manner of recruitment employment laws? Because you can't ask someone's sexual orientation. You're not allowed, quite rightly, by the way. You're not allowed. If you apply for a job in this country, the prospective employer has no right to say to you, hey, by the way, are you gay, are you? Are you a lesbian? None of their business. So maybe Tunde will head off to Lesbania to find a few good lesbians. Where's Lesbania, you ask? Used to be Lesbos, didn't it, Greece? I give up. And I'm going to finish with this for a minute. 20 minutes past the hour. I'm going to finish with this for a minute, he says. I'm going to finish with this before we move on. Mad story yesterday. Restaurant in Salisbury. They locked down a restaurant in Salisbury yesterday. It's a Prezzo restaurant, one of these awful chains that purports to be an Italian restaurant when it's just crap. Right, it's just a chain. Rubbish, not a proper Italian, run by a family where you get proper home-cooked food. No, just a chain. Apparently, it's still on lockdown today despite finding no Novichok yesterday. What happened yesterday? Well, a male diner collapsed at one of these Prezzo restaurants in Salisbury. He was dining with a woman and he collapsed, and immediately a major incident was declared and the police started turning up in the hazmat suits. Like a scene from Outbreak with Rene Russo and Dustin Hoffman. They turn up with all the suits, or like that E.T. at the end of E.T. when they're all turning up in the hazmats. But the police said nothing to worry about. It wasn't Novichok. Roads were cordoned off. I mean, absolute chaos. And the fact that the man who allegedly fell ill is Russian leads me to suspect, and I have no proof of this, that is a hoax. Maybe it's a Russian gentleman living in the UK who's absolutely cheesed off at all this garbage about Russia and poisoning, that maybe he decided to do a hoax, maybe. I wonder. Good for him if that is indeed what happened yesterday, but I have no evidence to support that. This is Monday's Richie Allen Show. The time is 22 minutes past the hour. Going to take a very quick break. When we come back, Dr. Chris Busby will be live with me. Very interesting stuff going on in his life right now. Dr. Chris Busby in exactly 90 seconds.
Have you lost access to important data from a computer hard drive, mobile phone, or other storage device? Maybe you have a broken hard drive containing years of information, or a smartphone that no longer works from which you'd like the pictures, movies, and chats recovered. If you would like to recover data from any type of digital device, including desktop and laptop computers, external hard drives, cameras, smartphones, NAS, and RAID servers, then contact Data Clinic today at dataclinic.co.uk now.
Introducing the H2O app, a powerful water structure and application that programs vibrational energies into water through the use of different sound frequencies. Once programmed, the use of water for drinking, cooking, bathing. Give it to your friends and colleagues or spread it around the garden. The list goes on. It's not just water that the app can be used for either. It's great for programming crystals too. The H2O app is free to download and is available on both Android and Apple platforms. For further information, go to h2oapp.online.
There's a place high in the mountains of Spain, a sanctuary where souls gather from all around the globe to learn about themselves and experience powerful changes in the way we see our world. They become awakened to their gifts and their power to heal others. Become part of this ever-growing worldwide family of unique, pure energy healing practitioners. Discover how amazing you truly are. Go to www.markbayerski.com. It could just change your life forever. Forever.
Welcome back to the most listened to independent radio show in Europe. It's your Richie Allen Show.
It is 24 minutes past the hour. A lot of tweets about my first guest. Now, I've got a lot of time for my first guest. Let me tell you who he is. He's a scientist and an expert on the health effects of ionizing radiation. He's qualified in chemical physics. He did so at the Universities of London and Kent. And I came across him when I read a series of articles in The Independent nearly 10 years ago, because he co-authored a study entitled Cancer, Infant Mortality and Birth-Sex Ratio in Fallujah, Iraq, 2005 to 2009. That study found that incidence of cancer, infant mortality and congenital birth defects had increased in the town of Fallujah, which had been bombarded by US forces in 2004. Remember, the US admitted at the time using white phosphorus and other munitions. They had in fact used depleted uranium munitions. Now, I believe my guest and his co-authors should have been awarded a Nobel Prize for that work. It is that serious. Now, late last week, police officers visited his home in Devon, which has its own lab. The police there said its inquiries were about public safety and not criminal matters. He was held for 19 hours under the Explosives Act before being released with no further action. Many of his followers believe that he is being retaliated against because of the work that he has done in the past, but also because he has appeared on Russia TV, RT we should call it, recently, to give a different point of view about the Salisbury poisoning incidents. Let's welcome to the programme Dr. Chris Busby. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you on the programme. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. I've recovered from my ordeal. I'm okay.
What an ordeal, Chris. What happened exactly? How did this come about?
Extraordinary. Well, I was up in North Wales working on a little boat that I've got there, and I got a call from a policewoman who said that there was a woman who claimed to be living in my house, and somebody had reported that she was acting strangely, and would I confirm that she was living in my house? So I said yes. This is Ruth, and she lives in my house, and I look after her. She's a very beautiful young woman, but rather loopy. She's Swedish. And so I talked to her and calmed her down, and I thought that was the end of it. But then I told the policeman when I was coming back the next day. That was Thursday. This happened on Wednesday. So then I thought, well, I'd better come back in case she's upset, So I drove five hours from Wales down to Bideford, and whilst I was on the road, I got a call from my daughter Cecilia, Dr. Cecilia Busby, who lives in Torrington. And she told me that there was a whole load of police outside the place, and that they'd sealed it off. There were 2 fire engines and 4 ambulances. Wow. And a whole load of policemen and some sort of specialist poisons unit, people in green, with gas masks and whatnot, all that stuff. But that they told her she had to take Ruth away because they were sealing the place. So she took her back to her place in Torrington. So what I did was, when I came back down, I went to Torrington to see, first of all, to see Ruthie was okay, because she would have been a bit upset about being thrown out of the house and so forth. And then whilst I was there, after I was there for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, the door was pushed in and 2 policemen came in. They were called Williams and Morgan, a couple of Welshmen, I guess. One was a Sergeant Williams. And they said, Christopher Busby, we're arresting you under Section 2 of the Explosives Act 1883. So I said, what's all this about? They said, well, you're not obliged to say anything, but, and all that stuff. And they said, well, we have to handcuff you. I said, well, why? So they said, when we don't have to say anything, you have to be handcuffed now. So hold your hands out like this. So they clacked some enormous great manacles on me, really tight too. So they were quite painful. So I had to ask them to sort of, release them slightly. They both seemed extremely frightened. I don't understand quite why, because I'm a 73-year-old man. These were two big beefy cops. But anyway, I don't know whether they thought I was going to fell them with one karate blow or something. But anyway, So they then took me out of the door and threw me into a cage in the back of a van. Now, they had a police car there, so they could have just put me in the back of the police car. But they took me to this van, which had a sliding door, pushed me into there. And in the back of the sliding door was some metal cage painted white. I don't know, sort of thing you might put a mad dog in. So I got pushed into the metal cage with my handcuffs. And they clacked the door shut and then shut it all and drove me to about half an hour down the road to Barnstaple police station and took me out at that end, where they took all my clothes and everything away from me. They impounded my car, which was at Celia's place in Torrington, and they threw me in a cell. So there I was in a cell, basically all night, and then it was a bit like, sort of Eastern European film, like something in Turkey, with the doors banging and opening and sliding, the doors sliding open and people peering in and clash and clang and bang and whatnot, while I sort of sit in there with nothing on except sort of a police cell uniform, which is like a sort of tracksuit, and a blanket, and it was jolly cold, I can tell you.
Nobody said anything, Chris. Nobody spoke to you to say, are you okay, or let you know what was going on, gave you any indication of what was happening. They just left you there overnight.
Well, no, absolutely not. What happened is that at 2 a.m, they said I had to be interviewed by CID. And I said, look, I'm really tired. I've driven all the way from... Also, I was cold, So I asked them for another blanket, and that wasn't enough because they were really crappy blankets, I have to say. And then I said, can I have a third blanket? I said, no, you can't, because there's some sort of limit to the number of blankets you can have. They did wheel me out before they threw, at some point just after being in the cell, I was wheeled out to some paramedic guy who wanted to take my blood pressure and this and that. But I said, no, I'm not going to have you touch me. And the other thing they did was they tried to take my nice magical ring, my blue ring. I've got a beautiful blue ring, which is on my finger. And they said, we're going to take that. I said, well, you won't get it off because I've had it a long time and my sort of finger's grown around it. They said, oh, yes, we will. And so they almost pulled my finger off trying to take this bloody ring off, So in the end, I said, look, that hurts. You're going to break my finger. And so they backed off at that point, which was a sort of small little win
small
for
victory,
me.
Yeah. So when you spoke with these CID guys...
that was 2 a.m. So they wheeled in some court solicitor guy who told me what the deal was, which is that, under Section 2 of this Act, if you have chemicals or materials that are capable of making a bomb, like chemical A and chemical B that could in principle be put together to make a bomb in some way, it's the onus is on you to prove that you're not going to make a bomb, that you have some legitimate reason for having these chemicals. But the extraordinary thing is that they didn't have a warrant to go in here. I mean, they gave me this booklet called the criminal, something like Police and Criminal Evidence Act 2004 or 1983 or something or another. So I had nothing else to read, so I sat there reading it for a while. And it seems that you have. I said, look, you should have had first of all, you should have had a warrant. And secondly, you could have phoned me up and asked me if you'd gone in there, even without a warrant, and found some chemicals. You could have asked me what they were for before just sending somebody down here to put manacles on me and throwing me in the back of a car. And they said, no, we don't have to say anything to you. We can do exactly as we please under Section 18. Well, I don't know what Section 18 is because it wasn't in the book they gave me.
But they must have known who you were, Chris. I mean, you're a well-known scientist.
Well, this is, I mean, they know who I am. They could look me up on the blooming internet. I've got about 5 million hits on the internet and a picture of me saying scientist. So, I mean, it's not so extraordinary that I should have some chemicals in a lab at the back of my place,
So is that why,
anyway.
because I was reading, Kurt Nimmo wrote a piece for Activist Post, and I read some other stuff on RT, and you've got a lot of supporters, and I'm not going to pretend to be objective, I'm one of them, around the world, and people are saying, well, is this retaliation? Because if it was true initially that Ruth, the young lady, had a bit of an episode, that's fair enough, but all of a sudden it became very dubious about chemicals. None of it makes any sense. So people are saying that this might be a kind of, a shot across your bow, as it were, because you're obviously very vocal, obviously a man with, impeccable qualifications, and you're presenting at times on different issues a counter narrative to the one that we get rammed down our throats all the time. So people are saying they're trying to make a point to Chris. Do you think that?
Well, I think it's worse than that, really. I mean, I thought it through afterwards, and there are lots of little aspects of it which when you put together like Sherlock Holmes, makes up a picture. I think the idea was to frighten me. I mean, I think that these people were told to give me a bad time. They were told to throw me in the cell. They were told to put manacles on me and throw me in a cage and not tell me what it was all about, etc., etc., on the basis of no evidence at all. Because in fact, when it came to the interview, they asked me about what sort of chemicals I had here that could make a bomb. But none of the chemicals I've got here, which in principle could make a bomb, were chemicals that they could see anyway, because they were tucked around the back, and they just came in here. They sent some guy in here, and they said, oh, yes, he's making a bomb. And the only thing they had, when it came down, they read me a long list of chemicals. Did I have this? Did I have this? Did I have this? Mostly I didn't. Only one that they said that they found was chapati flour. Can you imagine?
Wow. I don't know what that is. I'm going to be honest, I don't know what that is, Chris.
Chapati flour is a sort of Indian flour for making chapatis, which are kind of Indian bread cakes, okay, which I quite like. And I've got a little thing for making these things. And I've got this flour. It's flour, all right, like you make bread out of.
Yeah, okay.
Right? So there's a sack of flour here, which means I'm going to make a bomb. I mean, the whole thing was ridiculous. But actually, I'm quite good at this because I've done lots and lots of court cases. I've been lots and lots of positions where I've been deposed by much more horrifying lawyers than those two squirts from the CID. And so I mean, it didn't faze me at all. And at the end of it all, I said, look, guys, you're talking about bringing me into a Crown Court, because that's what this is. You're talking about a serious crime here, Section 2, blah-de-blah. You've got to get me into a Crown Court, and you're going to have to persuade a jury that Christopher Busby, with 40 research papers and all of these, associated with several different universities and academies of sciences and goodness knows what, is a bomb maker. I said the chance of you doing that, especially when we get in the lawyers from hell, are going to be sort of absolutely 10 to the minus 15. So I don't know why on earth you're doing this sort of thing. So anyway.
Really good, Chris. Let me just remind our listeners, Dr. Chris Busby is live on the line. He's an eminent scientist. Chris, he served on government committees. He's written, as he said, dozens and dozens of peer-reviewed papers, chemical weapons expert, an expert in all things chemical, biological, let's be honest about it. I came across him when he did that phenomenal and very important work on Fallujah. He's been harassed last week, towards the end of the week, undoubtedly harassed by local police, taking him in on, kind of a farcical story about the idea that he might have had bomb-making chemicals in his laboratory, kept him in, put manacles on him, embarrassed him, or tried to embarrass him anyway. People are asking the question, is it because of the work that Chris does in challenging the official narrative, which I mentioned earlier on? Now let's get to the Skripals, because you've been speaking out about Chris, I don't know anything about chemicals or chemical weapons or physics or biology, chemicals, whatever, no, nothing. But even to a lay person, the story about the Skripals and what happened to them allegedly, and Dawn Sturgis, has got a lot of holes in it, even to a guy like me. You've been pointing out those holes. Tell us about that and how that might be related to what happened to you last weekend. Tell us about this Skripal poisoning theory. Do you buy, first and foremost, do you buy the government narrative that two men came into the country with Novichok disguised in a perfume bottle, tried to smear it on a door handle and poisoned the Skripals, and it inadvertently killed somebody else? Do you buy this?
Well, no. I mean, there are an enormous number of holes, but I haven't been saying much about it lately because my main point has to do with my scientific knowledge of the ways in which you detect chemicals. I mean, this is something I know about because I used to do this sort of thing as a job for the Wellcome Research Laboratories in Beckenham. I started out as a spectroscopist, as somebody who analysed very, very small quantities of organic chemicals. So right at the very beginning, when they said that this stuff was Novichok and that it was, and that it was definitely Russian and it came from a Russian laboratory and all that stuff, all I said, I didn't say that it wasn't Russian or that it didn't come from a Russian laboratory. I said that it was not possible for them to know that. And if they were saying that, then they were lying. That was basically my position, because chemically, in terms of the science of it, the physical chemistry of analysis, there was no way that what the government was saying could be other than a lie. And so everything then follows from that. So you have to say, well, then why were they lying and what went on behind it? And, there's a whole load of theories about why it is that this has happened and so forth. But my point was just a purely scientific one. It's that they are lying about when they say that they know that it came from Russia. They couldn't possibly have done that. That was a lie.
Let's not forget what Chris is referring to there partly is that Boris Johnson was the Foreign Secretary at the time, and he made an outrageous statement which he had to retract. He said that he'd visited Portendown and that they had assured him that it was Russian. It had been made in Russia. And Chris is pointing out that they couldn't possibly have known that. I think later on, the folks at Portendown said that they hadn't actually said that to Johnson. But it seemed to be, kind of one story contradicting the story that went before it. How important could it be, Chris? And fair play to you, by the way, for being honest and saying that you've not tried to apportion blame or anything like that. You're a man of science. But how relevant is the proximity of Salisbury to the chemical weapons depot, if you want to call it that, at Portendown?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's relevant, but the main question is what went on and why did it happen and so forth, and part of my problem with all of this stuff, the ratcheting up of attacks on Russia, is that it comes along at roughly the same time of Brexit, and because I do have a political analysis in all of this. I mean, I was a science and technology speaker for the Green Party of England and Wales for many years, and I do keep an eye on on global geopolitics because it's important, and all of us should, because the whole world is going to pieces as the American petrodollar empire collapses. And an enormous fight on for control of oil resources, because these things are key to the survival of many, many countries. And it's also an environmental issue as well. So I keep an eye on, and I have kept an eye on this for a very, very long time. And so what I see is happening, also because I live in Latvia, I see that there's been a sort of split up in Europe about what to do about Russia. Basically, that's it. And so a lot of the Europeans are quite nervous about the way in which NATO is ratcheting up its attacks on Russia and its materiel. So like the Americans want to pour huge amounts of money into making missiles and putting missile bases in Poland and saying that Putin is a madman who wants to take over the world and so forth. And I live in Latvia, and in the time I've been there since about 2009, I've actually seen it happening. And I've met people in Latvia working for the British Army and for NATO who actually have a project. What they do, their project is to get stories out into the Latvian media suggesting that the Russians are just on the border and they're only a short distance away in time, marching in and taking over the country. Whereas actually that's absolute nonsense. So you have to sort of think about what's going on behind the scenes. And what's going on behind the scenes is that they want to prevent the Russians, who have an enormous amount of oil resources and gas resources, because they've got a vast country that is at the moment being warmed up. So they have access to more and more Siberian resources, and this country is extreme, has a lot of wealth in terms of its resources. And they see that as a threat. And that it certainly is a threat to the extraction of oil from the Middle East, because the Russians can just pipe it straight into Europe. In fact, they do pipe it straight into Europe. So obviously the Russians don't want to have a pipeline built from Saudi into Europe. So they and the Syrians and the Iranians are blocking that pipeline. And so, of course, the rent-a-terrorist mob who did over Libya and did over Iraq. And of course, I was in on the Iraq thing, because the effects of the Iraq war were absolutely catastrophic. I see all this global machination as part of a general direction, which includes Brexit and now includes the British as being like the sharp end of the American attack on Russia. And what worries me about it is that it could end up in nuclear war and then we're all dead.
And the Russians are saying that the propaganda war against them is relentless. And now that Assad's troops and the Russian aerial support has basically brought us to kind of check, if you look at it from that point of view, to the checkmate kind of position in Idlib. The Russians have been saying this week, Chris, and this is right up your street, they've been saying that they're expecting at any time now chlorine to be used and for the Russians to be blamed. Do you have some sympathy with the Russians worrying about that? How easy is it, Chris, to use something like chlorine and to make it look like somebody else did it, what we call, I think, a false flag? How easy is it to do that?
It doesn't matter anymore. This is the problem. A number of people have pointed out in the last 5 years, certainly more increasingly in the last 2 years, that truth, the concept of truth, is entirely irrelevant now.
Redundant.
You can say what you like, So it's not a question of anyone actually doing it or dropping the chlorine cylinders or whatever. And of course they can do that because it's quite easy to get hold of chlorine. It's much more difficult to get hold of these serious nerve gases like sarin and all the nitrogen mustards and all those things, the old war gases. But chlorine is used all over the place in swimming pools, and it's used for water purification and so forth. So cylinders of chlorine are around all over the place. Okay, so somebody can come along and switch on a chlorine cylinder and let the chlorine out, everybody gets gassed, and they've also got a video unit there taking pictures of everybody dying, and then they say, oh, this was evil Assad and his evil Russian supporters, etc., so let's fire a load of missiles in there. Now my concern is this, that Putin knows all this. He's not an idiot, and he knows, he can see all the pressure winding up to take him down, and the Russians, the Russians are not like, I mean, I live with Russians in Riga. And the Russians are not like, they don't have the same culture as the Americans, The Americans are basically weedy people who shout and yell and scream and so forth. But the Russians don't fuck about, If they're going to do something, they do it. That's the problem. That's the problem I see. And the other problem is that, I've studied the health effects of ionizing radiation partly because I want to head off apocalypse. Because under the current radiation risk model, and this is the one that governments have, and certainly the generals believe, that this is the risk model that allows them to use depleted uranium weapons, because they say the doses to people who are in the areas where they use it are very low and it can't possibly cause any effects. In fact, the research that I do, and one of those bits of research is that Fallujah research that we did, shows that the uranium effects, which are a combination of chemical and radiological, and those are the effects that we saw in the nuclear test veterans, of which I've done a number of court cases in the High Court in London. These effects are like 1,000 to 10,000 times greater than is predicted by the current risk model. So if there is a nuclear war, it's not something that somebody is going to sit out and survive and then come out afterwards from their little bunker and say, oh, well, that's all right. We've lost 3/4 of the population of the world, but everything's fine now for us. It's not going to happen. What's going to happen is that the genetic damage engendered by the radiotoxicity of this stuff, and it's got a life of about 10 billion years, 4.7 billion years half-life. That's it. That's it. That's the end. And so I really don't want any of this stuff to happen, and that's why I'm doing what I do.
How frustrating is it for you? Because I want to go back to Fallujah. I remember nearly 10 years ago speaking regularly with Robert Fisk. And Robert, of course, wrote those articles in the Independent where you and your colleagues got full credit for the work you were doing there. And I remember it was terrible to read. It was dreadful to read, and the photographs were terrible. It must have been very difficult for you, even as a scientist. You're a human being and you're a father, to see what was happening in Fallujah. Did you think at the time, Chris, when you published the paper, which was meticulous and was absolutely unimpeachable, did you think that it would be a big game changer? And if you did, go ahead.
I'm afraid I'm naive enough to imagine everything that I do is a big game changer, but life has taught me that actually what happens is that these people who are extraordinarily powerful and have access to the media can just dismiss and marginalize it all. And the thing that's happened since then, so that paper was written around about 2010, something like that, I remember. But since then, we've had Fukushima. And so what happened after Fukushima, and then what increasingly happened after Greg Neal and the BBC and all that sort of stuff, is that the media have been taken over in some way. So stuff that tells the truth, and a lot of my stuff is just basic epidemiological studies, like the fracking one that I did, where quite recently I looked at it with Joe Mangano. I looked at Pennsylvania and looked at all the counties where they did the fracking and compared them with the counties that didn't do the fracking, and found that they caused the deaths of infants. Okay, the increase in infant mortality. So the genetic damage just from fracking is killing people. But that never got into. I mean, you would think that was an enormous headline, right? But it never got into one single newspaper. I press released it. It went into a peer-reviewed journal. It'd been peer-reviewed, been written, it'd been meticulously researched. There was a little map showing it, and statistical stuff, all of that stuff. It never got into one single newspaper. It didn't. So I think the problem now, and it's been pointed out by others, is that the news it's like the Soviet Union now. The news in the West is just Sovietized,
compromised,
and they just give you a load of rubbish, and people are supposed to believe it.
Well, I come from commercial and national media myself. It's one of the reasons I got out, was because there were stories I wasn't allowed to cover. That's the gospel truth. They weren't stories as huge as the stories that you've covered, Chris, but corruption and stuff like that. In my hometown, where we had bang to rights, we had all the evidence you could ever need to go to print, or in my case, go on air with, and I was told you can't do that because certain people in the ownership of the station were friendly with certain other people, and we couldn't do it. And I've seen it coming for years. But you don't give up, though, Chris. I wanted to mention, I should have mentioned this about 10 minutes ago. It was on my little list of bullet points there. The press did say that 2 of these policeman plod types who went around to your house without a warrant became slightly ill. Is that just nonsense, Chris?
No, they did. They went out and they were sort of feeling very ill, and so they sent all these ambulances along and they treated them and so forth. And so you have to ask the question, why did they feel ill? Well, my own feeling is that the ghosts in this house got them, the spirits here. And that's, Oliver said that too. But this is quite a weird house. This is a very, very old house, 1542. It was, the Sir Richard Grenville, the famous pirate, an Elizabethan hero, was born here in 1542.
That's amazing.
It's a very, very old house, and it's a very weird house. And because I live here, it's got a lot of very weird stuff here too, you see. So I think they were so unused to the kind of thing that they see here. They came in here, and then also with all the Skripals and that kind of Novichok hysteria and all the rest of it, these 2 plod were just like feeling very, very nervous, and they just had a panic attack. And I think that's probably...
That could very well be right, yeah. It might not have been the ghosts of experiments past,
No. Well, there's 2 alternative explanations, but maybe both of those are correct.
I want to thank you, Chris, from the bottom of my heart. This has been a meeting that for me is important. It's something I should have done or tried to do a long time ago, because those reports, your report, you and your fellow scientists' report on Fallujah, and the writing of Robert Fisk, very important to me as a journalist reading that. And I meant what I said at the beginning. It's Nobel Prize stuff. It's courageous stuff, and you should have been properly recognised for it. But of course, we've just explained why that isn't the case.
Well, the take-home message here, I think, for me and for everyone, is that in life you have to be brave, and there's too much cowardice in the world now, and that's the problem.
You're absolutely 100% right. I'm getting questions from listeners, which I'm not going to put to you because our time is up and you have other things to do, probably better things to do. But I'd like to invite you back on, because I've had a couple of questions there, interesting questions about ionizing radiation, which are interesting, and a couple of questions about Fukushima. So with your permission, in a few weeks or so, if you could spare a half an hour, Chris, it'd be nice to do it again.
Okay, fine.
And I really appreciate you coming on today. Thanks so much for your courage, Chris. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine.
And
Yeah,
bye for now. That was the amazing Dr. Chris Busby live on the line to us. He's in Devon now, but of course he mentioned earlier on, Chris also has a residence in Riga in Latvia. Hugely important stuff, that. Talking there about his wrongful arrest and wrongful detention over nothing, over what amounted to absolutely nothing, and why that might be linked to Chris throwing some scepticism on claims, very early claims, by certain UK government officials that they knew that the Novichok originated in Russia. And Chris explained why they couldn't have known that at the time. Maybe it was retaliation for that. Dr. Chris Busby live on the line to us today. It's 7.5 minutes to the top of the hour. This is the Richie Allen Show, by the way. Loads of tweets came in on that. Massive amount of tweets. I'll get to some of them in a minute. And I will get him back on to ask questions. David Stanford there had a question. Other listeners had questions about Fukushima as well, which he's written about extensively. And he talked about fracking there. I did know, because Tina Rothery had brought up on a programme previously, about a year or so ago, that he had been talking about the harmful effects of fracking, the actual fracking procedure, and the effects of that on children. He's written about that as well. And as he said, he wrote a peer-reviewed paper, published a peer-reviewed paper, got into the journals, but the UK media just decided to ignore him. Right, what shall we do? Shall we take a break? I'll tell you what, I will take a break, and when I come back from that break, some of your comments. Don't forget, we're off to Ottawa in Canada in the second hour of the programme. I'm going to be talking to a intelligence expert, author and broadcaster Tom Quiggin. Had a chat with Tom today. Seems like a really nice guy. And we're going to talk about political Islam in Canada and around the world. Why Tom believes it's on the rise. Who's really behind it? What are the forces driving it? Really interesting guy, and we'll talk about his book as well. Tom Quiggin on Monday's Richie Allen Show in around about 15 minutes time. First of all, quick break.
There's a place high in the mountains of Spain, a sanctuary where souls gather from all around the globe to learn about themselves and experience powerful changes in the way we see our world. They become awakened to their gifts and their power to heal others. Become part of this ever-growing worldwide family of unique, pure energy healing practitioners. Discover how amazing you truly are. Go to www.markbayerski.com. It could just change your life forever. Forever.
Have you lost access to important data from a computer hard drive, mobile phone, or other storage device? Maybe you have a broken hard drive containing years of information, or a smartphone that no longer works from which you'd like the pictures, movies, and chats recovered. If you would like to recover data from any type of digital device, including desktop and laptop computers, external hard drives, cameras, smartphones, NAS, and RAID servers, then contact Data Clinic today at dataclinic.co.uk now.
Introducing the H2O app, a powerful water structure and application that programs vibrational energies into water through the use of different sound frequencies. Once programmed, the use of water for drinking, cooking, bathing. Give it to your friends and colleagues or spread it around the garden. The list goes on. It's not just water that the app can be used for either. It's great for programming crystals too. The H2O app is free to download and is available on both Android and Apple platforms. For further information, go to h2oapp.online.
The Richie Allen Show relies on your support. Go to richieallen.co.uk and set up a monthly donation today. Welcome back to the most listened to independent radio show in Europe. It's your Richie Allen Show.
Yes, do me a favour and check out triggerwarning.tv. Check out the Cogent Radio app. You'll find programmes there like the Trigger Warning Show with Graham and Hayden Hugh. Terrific stuff, really good stuff. Different opinions expressed, a different take on the political events of the week than the take that I give you. And that is no bad thing at all. Hayden Hewitt and Graham, great stuff. Right, a lot of tweets. I'm going to get to some of them now. Tom Quiggin, Tom has checked in, which is great. He's there. We'll get to Tom in a few minutes' time. I'm sure you'll have a lot to say when I'm speaking with Tom. Again, you know the Twitter handle. It's at Richie Allen Show. At Richie Allen Show. Hi to William Henderson. How you doing, William? Interesting stuff, he says. Blatant harassment from the police boils my piss, so it does. Natasha tweets, lots more if Chris please, and no offence Richie, but shut up and let your guests talk more. You continually interrupt them mid-point. Challenge them after they finish, says Natasha. Natasha, in one word, fucking bollocks. Utter bollocks. This is not a monologue show, love. We ask questions here. We have a finite amount of time. We don't have 1 hour, 1.5 hours, 2 hours with guests. We have to move things along. Alrighty, thank you. Base Ninja tweets, Chris, what a great guest. In my opinion, he's been stiffed over due to his opinions. Well, it's an opinion that a lot of people share. Faisal tweets, we don't have anything like a free media. We have a Soviet-style Ministry of Truth, which is a much more serious enemy of the people than even the alternative media considers. Tiger Johnson tweets, great stuff from Chris Busby. Thanks, Richie. I did notice earlier on today that Tiger was tweeting out, do try and get Chris Busby on the programme. Thanks for that, Tiger. I had been following that story over the weekend. Great minds think alike and fools seldom differ is the old cliche there. Hi to Spirit Samba, to Patrick Vidine. How you doing, Patrick? And to everybody else who's tweeting this Monday. Hope you've had a good Monday. Of course, you could be just about to set out for work now. You could be on the evening shift. You could be in the middle of it. You could be on the 4 to 12 shift. You might be. You might be on the 12 to 8 a.m. shift tomorrow. God forbid. Hi to Diane, who says, indeed, it's good to hear this sort of info from a real scientist who can look at the data and report without twisting it to suit a narrative. Diane, cheers for that. Really appreciate that. Right, we are going to have some music then. This is Queen. And I'm going to be speaking about political Islam in a couple of minutes' time. We're always seeking out opinions that are a bit different from mine. No harm in that. And enjoyed speaking with Tom Quiggin earlier on. Tom's going to join me. He's an author, broadcaster, podcaster is Tom. And he's worked in intelligence for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, if I've said that right, and many other institutions as well. Going to talk about Canada, going to talk about this country as well with him. It might trigger one or two of you. No bad thing either. Tom Quiggin in a couple of minutes. This is I Want to Break Free from Freddie and the Boys.
I want to break free.
A number of you are tweeting about RT, saying that you think it has its own agenda. Well, of course you're right to think that. It doesn't matter. I've said this before 1,000 times. Even if I believe, for example, take the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, and I believe that Putin is on the right side of history when it comes to supporting the Syrian government in its bid to rid the country of the Wahhabist, lunatic, jihadist, whatever you want to call them, head choppers, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, whatever name you want to give them. Russia is on the right side of that. Russia is on the right side of the Ukraine situation. It is. I believe the propaganda war against Russia is obvious, it's self-evident. But it doesn't mean that Vladimir Putin is an angel. It does not. And I've said this time and time again, and people can't get their heads through this. This is the problem with identity politics. I did programs years ago about the Sochi Olympics and the endemic corruption that went on around those Olympics. I've heard reliable sources, and I don't mean BBC journalists, and I don't mean CNN journalists, but journalists, respected journalists that I've known over the years, older folks, who've talked about corruption in these places, people who know about people like Vladimir Putin, his cabal, his circle of friends. Don't be fooled for a minute. Russia today does a lot of great stuff, and I like it, and I like some of their presenters. And I've mentioned one or two of them before on the programme. But of course it has an editorial policy. It has an agenda. It has a narrative that it wants to present. Of course it does. It's laughable, however, to hear UK politicians speaking on BBC radio urging people to boycott RT, saying that politicians shouldn't appear on it because it's just propaganda. It's laughable. It's so ironic. Surely they must be choking on the irony to be saying that while being interviewed by a BBC presenter. It's beyond funny to somebody like me. Let us introduce then our next guest. A really interesting man, so he is. By the way, tweet me. It's at Richie Allen Show on Twitter. At Richie Allen Show if you want to make a comment on this. I'm sure you'll have plenty to say. I'm looking forward to speaking with him. I had a nice chat with him today. He's got over 30 years of practical experience around security and intelligence. He served as a court expert in determining the reliability of intelligence as evidence. He's also worked in intelligence for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canadian Armed Forces and the UN Protection Force in Yugoslavia. So he's well placed to comment on these matters on political Islam, which is what he's doing here today. He's also he presents a podcast as well. I'll give you a link to that. And he recently published, co-authored a book called Submission: The Danger of Political Islam to Canada, with a warning to America. Delighted to welcome to the programme Tom Quiggin. Tom, you're very welcome. How are you?
Good afternoon, Richie. Glad to join you.
Thanks, and you're live in Ottawa. Thanks for doing it today. I really appreciate that. You got my attention, Tom, in a good way, because I was fascinated reading about you before I got in touch. You tweeted out way back in January, and it's all the more interesting because of the positions you've held. I've just given a bit of your resume there, just a little bit. Worked for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, for the UN. You know, you've testified in court cases as to the reliability of evidence. You're a qualified man. And you came out in January, and my ears went up straight away. You said that it is your expert opinion that the Canadian PM, Justin Trudeau, supports terrorist front groups. Within our Western system of parliament, he is politically accountable and responsible for Islamist terror attacks. How does he do that? How is he supporting terrorist front groups? Over to you, Tom.
Well, it's fascinating, Richie. He's been Prime Minister now for just coming up on 3 years, but he's been a member of Parliament for almost 8 years. So I went back and looked at his history from the time he was elected to Parliament up to today. And his belief system on a number of these issues is quite startling. So, for instance, a number of countries like the United Kingdom have struggled on what to do with returning ISIS fighters.
That's right.
You know, in the United Kingdom, I think one of your ministers said they should be killed over there. In America, they're going to throw them in jail. Not so in Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau, in the Parliament, speaking on the record, said that if Canadians are opposed to the return of ISIS fighters, it is because they are Islamophobic.
Wow.
I'm not making that one up. You can look at and see it in our Hansard.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I'm not going to argue with you. You are right. He did say that. Why did he say that? Because we've had an issue here with people coming back who fought against ISIS, mercenaries, and people are saying they should be locked up. Now, I think it might be a bit unfair to lock up some ex-army guy who went to fight with the Kurds. I think that's a bit extreme, it's a bit unfair. But if you went out to fight with ISIS, I don't want you back in this country. So why did he say that? That's bizarre.
Well, if you go back and look at Trudeau right from his childhood roots up to the present, along with his brother Sacha Trudeau, who's arguably worse than he is, he believes in a number of different things. He is a globalist or a post-nationalist, if you prefer that term. He would widely fall into that camp that we refer to as progressives or as cultural Marxists. He actually gave an interview in New York where he says there is no such thing as Canadian values because we are a post-national state.
Yeah.
He said our culture isn't shaped on the pan-European values of our two founding cultures of the English and the French, but rather we now have a pan-globalist culture. So I think it's fair to say that at the end of the day, he is a cultural Marxist at heart. He believes these sorts of values. He is very similar to folks like Jean-Claude Juncker of the European Union, who would argue that borders cause wars, so we need to get rid of borders. So here in Canada, for instance, our own beloved Prime Minister Trudeau put out this tweet in the middle of the sort of firestorm in the US about immigration, etc., saying that everyone was welcome to come to Canada. So we've had literal waves of immigrants pouring over the border from America into Canada, and the government's made no attempt whatsoever to close the border, to stop them or whatever. So much of what you're seeing happening in the United Kingdom, what you're seeing happening in Germany, what you're seeing happening in Europe overall, same sorts of things are happening here. More fascinating, and this to me is the real kicker, Prime Minister Trudeau went to something called the Reviving the Islamic Spirit Convention here in Canada. And the convention is a kind of who is who of radical Islamist causes, terrorist front groups, listed terrorist groups, all kinds of interesting folks show up at this thing. He actually sent a video to this conference once, and then he actually physically appeared in it. And he specifically referred to not, integration or how Canada's a melting pot kind of country. He actually said he liked the attendees because he shared their beliefs, he shared their values, and he shared their visions. So I think it's worth pointing that Prime Minister Trudeau is like I said, he's a cultural Marxist, he's a post-nationalist, and he actually sees Islamists and these kinds of folks as a sort of ally in breaking down pan-European values, Western values, Judeo-Christian values, whatever you want to call them.
Very interesting that. I mean, describing him, you might as well be describing somebody like Emmanuel Macron in France. Maybe they're, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, they're very similar in their outlook and their philosophy. I want to get into this. I'm obviously Irish. We spoke about this today, and Tom's got a great Irish surname, by the way, which originated in Norseland, in Norse times way back. Quiggin, it's a great name. And I told Tom, not that my accent gives me away anyway, that I'm Irish. Tom, I've lived in this country for years, but I used to come to the country in the 80s and 90s as a young lad to watch soccer, to watch the Manchester United soccer team. And I remember that there was, there was a sizable Sikh community, a sizable Muslim community, Muslims from Pakistan, Muslims from North Africa or whatever. And there would have been the same in the United States, maybe the same in Canada. What's changed, Tom? This is what I really wanted to dig down into, and I think you're the man to get into this with. What changed? It seems that our countries always had a population of sorts, a community of Muslims or a community of Sikhs or even Chinese. For years we had pockets of these communities and things were fairly smooth. What's happened in the last 20 years to make things evolve to the state that they've evolved now, where there's that much paranoia, that much fear, often based on genuine things, on genuine crime? We'll talk about the grooming gangs in a few minutes, I have no doubts. What changed, Tom, in 25 years? What do you think?
Hard to put a finger on any one thing, but to go down sort of a list, the first off is something called the Frankfurt School. It was a school of thought that came out of, surprise, surprise, Frankfurt, Germany. And it was a group of people in the 1960s who said, look, we can't sell communism, we can't sell Marxism because no one's going to buy this, especially when you're looking at the Soviet Union and China as the example. So they started this thing called the Frankfurt School, and they literally started to invert Western values. So when you hear things like about white privilege and why you hear about, Western values are corrupt and the West is responsible for slavery, et cetera, this is where this kind of thinking has come from. And it's spread throughout the academic system in the Anglophone world, i.e. United Kingdom, Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, a literal inversion of values. So one of the things that maybe you always heard about, the white nations were responsible for slavery, but it's like, hang up, just a second. The first people to ban slavery in history were, in fact, the United Kingdom back in 1832, if I recall correctly, something like that, followed by America. Here in Canada, we never had slavery as a thing. So, this is the kind of values they're trying to break down, and this is why I refer to some people like Jean-Claude Juncker or Prime Minister Trudeau as cultural Marxists. That's one thing. The other thing that happened is the Islamist groups, the political Islam folks, the folks who want to use Islam as a political force and drive it down our throats have been incredibly successful and financially very well supported in doing so, in infiltrating British government, Canadian government, the education system, academia. The groups behind this mostly are things like Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, the Khomeinists in Iran. But you would sort of see them in your areas like the Muslim Council of Britain or the Muslim Association of Britain, et cetera, et cetera. So those groups have been infiltrating Europe since the 50s and 60s. But starting in about the mid to late 90s, they put on a real well-funded push to invert, again, values and say that, Islam has to be accepted. And if you don't accept Islam in your neighborhood, it's because you're Islamophobic and there's something wrong with you.
Tom, can I just jump in? Can I just jump in there for 1 second? This is really important. I've seen evidence of that. That must have confused Muslim men, women and families at the time who were living peaceably, going about their business. Okay, they might have been segregated and, you know, live in their own areas of town, but living peaceably, getting on with people. I mean, we know them. I'm living in South Manchester, in the northwest of the country. There are a lot of Muslim families in my neighbourhood. You know, great people, are fine. They must have been perturbed or disturbed by the likes of the Muslim Council of Great Britain and these more political groups with the kind of more of a militant attitude. They must have been like, who are these people? They're not representing us. That's what I'm getting at. What do you think?
Yeah. What they've been is very successful in taking over a large number of community organizations, taking over student councils, taking over mosques, and putting their message into the community. So the Muslim community itself, of course, is badly divided on this. But depending where you look and what question you ask, right now, 30-40% of Muslims support things like Sharia law in their country. They say you shouldn't be allowed to insult the Prophet Muhammad without being killed for your efforts. But yeah, again, the silent majority of Muslims and the not so silent majority are starting to speak out, saying, you know, this is why they left Saudi Arabia. This is why they left Pakistan. This is why they left Qatar. This is why they left Syria, was to get away from these morons. And now they're very upset to see them in the British government. They're upset to see them in the Canadian government and increasingly in the Democratic Party in the United States as well. So yeah, for Joe Average Muslim, to use a North American expression, this has been a bit of a shock, and they're reeling a bit. They're not quite sure where to go with it. But the bottom line is the youthful community in the Islamic world is becoming increasingly radicalized, moved towards extremism. And if you do surveys of the youth versus the overall population, it's a bit shocking, frankly.
I want to talk about that. Yeah, I want to go back to the polls, though. I'm going to contradict you on the polls. I'm not saying for a minute that you don't have polls to back up your claim that 40% of Muslim folk would happily welcome Sharia. I'm not suggesting for a second that you've not seen polls that say that. It's just that I don't believe them. It's not been my experience. Listen, I'm not a virtue signaller. I'm not a cultural Marxist. I'm probably a champagne socialist, Tom, for my sins. But I don't see any evidence of that. I do want to talk about how young Pakistani men are becoming more and more conservative and radical, to use that word, in their views and how. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, because I think that is a problem. I've no doubt about it. But I don't buy into 40% want Sharia to come in and they want to take over. Tell you what really upsets me, Tom. We had the Manchester attack last May, and two things really annoyed me about that. The first was when the British police had to concede that the mosque that Salman Abedi was attending, you know, the imam of that mosque had on several occasions expressed his concern to the local police, and this is on the record, that this guy Salman Abedi was a bad kid, a bad seed, and he was going down a bad road, and nothing was done about it. And you know, Muslims might listen to this now and they say, oh, there's two white guys now, two Christian guys, and they're having a go. But we recognise this radicalisation ourselves. We tried to do something about it, and yet the police did nothing, Tom. Anyway, go ahead, over to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, on the issue of polling or whatever, it depends where you ask, who you ask, and what age group you ask. If you're in the outskirts of Paris, especially in the northwest area of Paris, you're going to find the numbers far exceed that. If you're in parts of Manchester, you'll find wide discrepancies depending which part of the country you're in. So, and it also depends how you ask the question. But bottom line is, if you look at polling outfits like Pew, which does global polls, they're a reasonably reliable outfit. It's actually scary to see how the youth are radicalizing right around the world, and that doesn't matter whether it's Saudi Arabia or Manchester. To go back to the Manchester thing, though, about why aren't the police acting on, you know, in this case, a single report of a guy who's identified by a competent authority as being a bad seed? Well, I mean, let's look at Rotherham or a few other places where people had known for years that there was a problem in Rotherham. They knew that girls, you know, aged 11 to 14 were being forced into prostitution, beaten, raped, drugged, and just about every horrible thing you can possibly imagine. And the police there did literally nothing. In fact, they did worse than nothing. They sometimes turned on people who were making the complaints.
Yes.
If you read the J report, one father was arrested by the police when he went over and grabbed his daughter back from a pimp. So there's, that sort of issue. If you have a long-term mass rape issue and the police and the social workers led by people like Joyce Thacker, was her name, Joyce Thacker, and the city council, if they won't do anything on a mass rape problem over a period of 10 years, well, you can see how the police won't take action on a single report on a single guy once.
Yeah, we learned, Tom.
In both cases, we see the results.
Yeah, I mean, we learned that the Home Office, it came from the top. The Home Office, which is Tom will know, maybe some of our listeners around the world might not know, but the Home Office and the Home Secretary is responsible effectively for policing. And I've heard from whistleblowers on this programme and from former police officers who said that the directive was coming from the Home Office. So that's where it gets very, very sinister, Tom. Why was the government effectively the government, telling police inspectors, the top police officers in Rotherham, in Yorkshire, why were they saying, don't investigate this, leave it alone? Why? You see, this is what...
There's a bunch of reasons for this. At the top of the list, however, goes political correctness or the social justice warrior ethic or progressive values or virtue signaling, however you want to call it. For someone who's in politics now, the absolute worst thing you can do to them is not catch them in bed with a goat or something like that. The worst thing you can do to a politician now is call them racist. So as soon as you say the word racist or homophobic or Islamophobic, almost every politician just collapses into a pool of, slush on the floor. They become quite useless. I think that's one reason. There was an actual statement in all of this from the Rotherham City Council that they didn't want to take action on the girls being raped because it would give oxygen to the racists. So, raping an 11 to 14-year-old girl, well, it's a bad thing. But what would be even worse would to risk being called racist by reporting it. So that's kind of one problem. Another problem area, I think, is we have a political class in Canada, America, Australia, the United Kingdom, large parts of Europe, that I'm not being facetious or offhanded when I say this, but we have a political class that is largely clueless as to what is the role of government. They do tend to forget that. And at the end of the day, we have a Westphalian state system, which controls, most of the planet. This is why we have a nation state system. And in your particular case, in the United Kingdom, you have a Westminster style of parliament. So the prime minister, as the sort of chief executive officer of the country, has one primary role, and that is defense of the realm. Or as over here, we would say, the safety of the republic, as the Americans would say. So they do tend to forget that. And I mean, this is not exactly hard stuff. If you go back and look at guys like Immanuel Kant, they said the safety of the republic is the highest law. John Locke says that, the most important thing was security of the people. And then across in France, Jean-Jacques Rousseau said the objective of the government is the social contract. In other words, we as citizens have given up the right to use violence in our day-to-day life, and we've turned over that role to the government. In exchange for that, the government is supposed to defend us against foreign invaders and against internal problems such as terrorist bombings, rapes, murders, knifing, stabbings, whatever. I think in the United Kingdom, it's fair to say there is a good chunk of the population who thinks the government has failed in its social contract. 17,000 moped muggings in the United Kingdom last year, the Manchester bombings, the bridge knifings in the United Kingdom, etc., etc. And then the mass rape problem that you have over there actually just staggers the imagination.
Yeah, we could talk. We could talk about that, and we will. And I know there are people listening to this program who are Muslims, and I've said this 1,000 times. We acknowledge, and I acknowledge that sexual violence is not the exclusive domain of any group of people or any religious group of people. We're talking about this because this has largely been, until recently anyway, underreported. I just want to read a couple of tweets. Faisal is Islamic. He might not be practicing Faisal, but he says the political Islamists are 90% sponsored by Saudi Arabia. In other words, Wahhabism. According to Dr. Dael Ganser, the vast majority of Muslims are for secular law, and the vast majority of victims, Islamic extremism, are moderate Muslims. And I want to just bring up this point. I know we could be here all day arguing about this point. You might have a different take than me, but I've been reporting for years on, the devastation of wrongful Western intervention in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq and in Libya, and what that's done. And I don't want to make this too simplistic. I don't want to make it childish. But when I hear people in France, you know, when I hear people that we might call progressives, and they might annoy us because they're progressives, but sometimes they will say, Richie, imagine your family, your house, your village was destroyed by drone strikes by the United States, by France, by the UK, by Israel. What do you think that's going to do to young men driven out of those countries? They've nowhere to go, and they end up in countries in southern Europe where they're not wanted. What's it going to do to them only to radicalise them? Wouldn't you want revenge of sorts, Richie? And again, that might sound simplistic, Tom, but it's fair to ask that question. It's a good question. What part has the military-industrial complex of the West played in radicalising young men in Rotherham, in France, in other parts of Europe? Go ahead.
Yeah, for sure it's a problem. I mean, the actual political science term is called blowback. If you do something over there, you sort of have to accept the idea at some point something may happen over here. That's exactly what you're referring to.
Yes.
But the political Islam that is behind the extremism, it's not Muslims who are behind this, it's the Islamists, those who believe in political Islam. And that, as I said, that's the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and the Khomeinists, and those kinds of groups. They got started long before the drone was invented, long before the United States had a foreign policy that took itself overseas. So yes, the blowback is responsible for a certain amount of it. But no, the actual extremism that is being developed is largely what you mentioned earlier, funded by folks like Saudi Arabia, although even Saudi Arabia is starting to question its own role now. Look at the state of Qatar or Qatar, whatever you're supposed to call it.
Yeah.
They are hugely into this. They're one of the leading powers right now in funding the worst kind of extremism that creates political Islam. And then the other countries behind a lot of this is Pakistan. So when people talk about the rapes that have occurred in Bristol, Derby, Rochdale, Peterborough, Rotherham, Dewsbury, Birmingham, Norwich, et cetera, I mean, your press uses the term Asians. And if I was an Asian in the United Kingdom, I think I'd sue the newspapers for being slandered like that. But who's actually doing this? And the vast majority of people involved in this are Pakistani Kashmiri Muslims. This is not Jordanians. It's not, Egyptians. It's not whatever. It's a very concentrated problem. But unfortunately, within that community, and especially in places like Pakistan and to a certain degree Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., this kind of behavior is actually permissible and to a certain degree expected. And you've seen a number of court cases in the United Kingdom where, the defendants have said things like, all the girls were slags, they weren't dressed correctly, etc., etc. The bombing plot in 2004, known to you folks as Operation Crevice, but known to us here in Canada as Operation Awaken, which I was a part of. I testified in the court trials. They were going to blow up, one of the plans was to blow up a nightclub called the Ministry of Sound, which I think is in Soho. And when one of the guys in the plot raised an objection saying, well, geez, we're just going to kill a bunch of civilians in a nightclub. What's the point? The answer was, well, the girls are just slags anyway.
Yeah.
And that's very much a prevailing attitude amongst the young, hard Islamist groups. You saw the same thing in Germany in Cologne, where when an imam was asked about the widespread attacks on women on one New Year's Eve, he said, well, what do you expect? They were wearing loose clothing and perfume.
See, this is really important. This is important stuff, Tom. Yeah, because I'm not going to argue with you. I've gotten into this on the program before. I'm not going to argue with you. You are right. Among predominantly Pakistani young men, there is a problem. And they see these girls as fallen from grace. If they plied them with drink or alcohol or drugs, the girls are worthless, and then they can be attacked in the manner they can be attacked. And some of these kids, it really strikes me as strange, it always has done, that these kids would find any truck with, the radical Islamists who might say, well, look what happened in Libya, look what happened in Iraq or in Afghanistan. Yes, that's dreadful and terrible. We can talk about all that all night, but it doesn't relate to third, fourth generation Pakistani kid who's grown up in any part of the UK. So I'm with you on that. There's no doubt about that. Tom, what about those who take this one step further and who say that, You know, great. I mean, Tom, you're effectively, with your experience, you're effectively a detective of sorts. I mean, you're an intelligence expert, broadcaster now, author. By the way, Tom's book, Submission, The Danger of Political Islam to Canada, with a Warning to America, is available on Amazon.com. Check it out. You can follow Tom on Twitter as well. What I wanted to get at is there are people who say that there's a global agenda, that there is an agenda, that there is a globalist agenda. And that agenda, this is part of it, the destabilization to drive migrants, to drive people out of their countries, to create a migrant crisis, because it serves as the age-old divide and conquer. And while people like you and me, not you and me because we can talk all day long, but while the alt-right and the alt-left are killing one another, not literally but maybe in the future, over these issues, the agenda moves on, a certain amount of people get richer and more wealthy, and the rest of us are divided along these lines of race. So could it be a plan, Tom? Could it be very conspiratorial, what we're witnessing?
I'm not a huge fan of conspiracy theories. As an intelligence analyst and as an individual, I've always been trained and both sort of find it normal enough to dig down past the surface information and dig down below it. So is there kind of a conspiracy theory to flood Europe with refugees? I don't think anybody's that organized. But if you ask a different question and you raise the question of wealth and say, is there a problem with Europe doing reasonably well over a long period of time? Well, Africa, per se, is just further collapsing into mayhem and, poverty. Will people want to move? And of course, the answer is yes. If you live in Africa, or if you live in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Syria, Turkey, any one of these countries, yeah, I mean, I can see why. If I was living in Rwanda, I'd sooner live in Rotherham, that's for sure. So at a certain point, the European governments, the European Union, although it's basically useless in this area, are going to have to decide what they want to do with their countries. Do they want to become the lifeboat for the poor of the world, or do they want to defend their borders and defend their lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera? So one of the most amazing things happened to me a couple of years ago at an intelligence conference. A number of what I might loosely call the tree huggers were invited into this intelligence conference. And these are the NGOs, the anti-human trafficking folk, the soft side of policy and what to do in migration, immigration. And their figures that we're about 60 million Africans are either on the move or want to be on the move to get out of their countries and move to Europe or Eastern Europe or America or wherever.
Who could blame them, right?
But wait for this, though. What struck me as stunning was what we would call the hardcore folks, the intelligence folks, the people who aren't noted for empathy and sympathy, whatever. Their numbers say it's more like 100 million. So even the NGOs in that, I would say, are underestimating the problem that Europe is facing with migrant flows. And if Europe couldn't figure out what to do with the last little round in 2015, 2016, wait till you see the next round. It's going to be multiple times worse.
I'm going to stay with my theory of method in their madness only for a minute, because I respect your answer. But Martin is listening in Spain. We've got listeners all over the European Union and the UK. And Martin is listening in Spain on the East Coast, on the Costa Blanca there. And he says, don't forget about people like George Soros and his open border foundations and his supporting of regime change in countries. Guys like this are not stupid. They know that if they support regime change in countries, that those countries are going to be horribly destabilised. I mean, Syria was perfectly fine, thank you very much, until about 10, 11 years ago. And Martin is making a very good point. With Soros and others pumping all this money in, these guys are not stupid. They know the inevitable consequences of their policies. They know that one of those consequences is you're going to have a migrant force which is going to come into Europe, which will do several important things, bad things. One, it will drive down wages, of course. It will make living conditions more difficult, and it will have a huge impact on public services. So Martin, just to finish on this point, Martin makes a good point. We can't ignore method in their madness, they being the globalists. Final point on that.
If you want to look at that sort of thing, I would say look a little further to the top and look at guys like Jean-Claude Juncker of the European Union. He certainly fits into that camp. George Soros, I know he sometimes gets portrayed as sort of like Dr. Evil. in the what were those British-made films? Can't remember them anyway.
Yeah, the Austin Powers films. Yeah, Austin Powers.
Yeah, Austin Powers. Yeah, he gets portrayed as kind of a Dr. Evil guy, and to a certain degree, yeah, that's a problem. George Soros supports an ideology which I would say is incredibly dangerous to the nation state. Literally believes in, if we just take down the borders and people can be free to move where they want, and then the markets will adjust the economy and we'll all live better. And to George Soros and Jean-Claude Juncker and others, I would say, if human nature was such that folks wanted to work together and build a better society, then I would almost agree with them. But unfortunately, if you go back and look at history, tribalism is a bit of an issue, and conquering the next guy over happens to be a rather significant part of our history. So as you see these waves coming into Europe, you don't see them sending thank you letters to the government going, oh my God, thank you for allowing me to be in The Hague or Berlin or London or wherever, and then saying, wow, how do I get a job? How do I participate? What you're seeing increasingly amongst the Islamists, and this is Algeria, Morocco, Syria, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and a few others, what you see coming from them is, now that we're here, you must adjust your system to our preferences. And if not, you're racist and Islamophobic. And of course, this is going to cause considerable discontent. So what I would say to George Soros, I would say, you are bringing more conflict in the future, which is going to be even uglier than the conflict you wanted to produce. If you do not have wars between borders, which is the Soros, Jean-Claude Juncker kind of idea, what you wind up instead is war between neighborhoods. If you want to look at a good example of that, start looking in Paris would be a good place to start. Start looking in parts of Brussels, where even the socialist mayor of Brussels finally came out and admitted that pretty much all the mosques in Brussels are in the hands of Salafists. So what we're going to see is what people loosely call no-go zones, or what the French call sensitive urban zones, whatever you want to call it. It's isolated communities where they say, no, we're going to run our community our way, and national law does not apply to us. It's a real issue. So that problem is coming down the pike. And I would argue it's happening right now in places like the United Kingdom, in places like Belgium, in places like France.
Yeah, and there's no point in ignoring it. I can be as champagne socialist as I want and can sympathise with my Muslim neighbours as I do, who must be sick and tired of listening to this. But we talk about it because you can't ignore it. I'm very interested in you talking about the tribalism. It's hard to have that utopia where we're all, close together and all getting on. I just go back to where we came in. Things used to be fine. I'm sure there were problems from time to time, but Muslims coexisted well in this country, particularly more than any other, over the years, until the last 20 years. And I also want to pick up on a point that you made, a brilliant point about Islamists not being Muslims, because you can make a great analogy there with Zionists and Jews, because there are people sometimes who contact this program and they want to blame Jews for everything. Whether it's, they're getting demoted in their job, whether it's whatever, blame the Jews for everything. Jews are not the reason. Jews are not to blame for anything, let alone everything. But you won't be surprised, as a champagne socialist, I would have a lot of issues with the ideology of political Zionism. There's a glaring difference between the two, and I'm interested in that. It's a great juxtaposition there, Islamist against Muslim and political Zionist against Jew. But go back to that point, Tom. They used to coexist fine in this country. Muslims just got on fine, and why couldn't it be the way it used to be?
Because there is so much money, so much effort, so much ideology, so much education going into driving the youth in the opposite direction. If you look at a number of Islamist front groups in the United Kingdom, it's quite startling. If you look at what they're teaching in their schools, it's quite startling. One of your schools in the United Kingdom, can't remember the name of it, just had the imam of the school arrested and jailed because he was teaching the children how to reenact attacks on the police, using this as a teaching lesson. And he was teaching children, jihad is a normal way of life and this is what they should be doing. Not every school over there is doing that, of course, but there are a bunch of schools which Ofsted has been looking at where they're teaching some pretty extremist lines. If you look at the student associations, you'll find the same thing. And many of the mosques, of course, are teaching the same lines.
Yeah. Do you know the parents of those children? I can tell you I can say this for a fact because I've met them around the Northwest. They are absolutely apoplectic when they hear stuff like that. You know, you're talking about ordinary people, and they find out that some visiting imam came into a faith school and started, you know, talking about the things you just described there. The parents are absolutely enraged by it. This is the thing. It's so frustrating. You know, you go back to the mosques where the imams are saying, I've got a kid here and he's going down a bad road, you know, and they point him out and then nobody does anything about it. I feel sorry for Muslims in this country, you know that? I really do. And it's not me being a bleeding heart liberal or lefty either. I just feel sorry for them. This is happening, what you're describing, but it's not their fault. And I don't think there's very much they can do about it in this climate. Now, I know you're going to contradict that. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I mean, you're right to a certain degree to say that a good chunk of Muslims, to a certain degree, left where they were to go to the United Kingdom, hoping to get away from this crap. And then to look around and find it in their neighborhood, it just drives them crazy. So that's true. But don't forget, there is also a rather large number of them, an increasing number of them, who are there specifically for this reason, i.e. to disrupt society. So if you look at guys like Yusuf Qaradawi, who's the inspirational cleric of the Muslim Brotherhood, he's quite clear on it. They're going to reconquer Europe for the third time through dawah, outreach, and population growth. One of the startling things that people tend to forget, and this is a history lesson, I've had some people tell me, this Muslim thing, it's nothing. Wait till they make 50% of the population plus one, and then give me a call. Well, here's the reality. Society can be drastically changed. The direction of it can be completely changed by a small dedicated portion of the population, which is 1 or 2 or 3%. So if you go back and look at Germany as it collapsed in the 1930s, the number of people that belonged to Hitler's party was, less than 2%, and effectively, well under 0.5% of people were actually participating. Same goes for the Soviet Union. The number of folks there who actually changed the course of that country, well under 1%. So it doesn't take a whole lot of people to have a critical impact on society. So just go back and look, for instance, after the Manchester bombing, which was, absolutely devastating to the city of Manchester. There was yet, another attack in London on the bridge where I forget, was it 7 people were killed or whatever it was? I can't quite remember.
Yes, London Bridge.
In June of 2017. After that, Prime Minister May came out, and I was actually surprised. She came out in front of number 10 Downing and gave this speech and said, there's been far too much tolerance of extremism. And she actually said, enough is enough, and the British government is now going to move. And I was kind of surprised. I'm not a huge fan of Theresa May, especially given her role as Home Secretary. But anyway, she said all the right things. She looked good. She sounded almost prime ministerial. I mean, not exactly, Churchill, but she at least sounded like she was the boss, she was in charge, and we're going to move. And I thought, all right, finally enough blood has been spilled in the United Kingdom, enough girls have been raped, enough children have been slaughtered at concerts, that she's going to make a move. So what happened on June 18th, like less than 2 weeks later? Hezbollah and Hamas had a parade on El-Quds Day where the police came out to protect the parade. 2 listed terrorist groups who are responsible for some of the most horrible stuff going on in the Middle East are able to have a parade in London protected by the police. And it's kind of like, wow, that speaks volumes. The other thing that Theresa May did, and this goes back to one of your earlier questions about who's doing this and who's responsible, is she immediately in that speech also blamed the tech companies and said the tech companies have to take a greater role in, de-radicalization and shutting down terrorism and all this sort of stuff. And it's absolute nonsense. You can blame Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, for some of this stuff. But the reality is it's going on in the schools, it's going on in the cultural associations, it's going on in the mosques. And the reason people like Theresa May attack the tech companies is because they lack the guts to go after the actual problems.
It's more sinister, Tom.
After the problem.
It's more sinister than that, in my opinion. I'll go along with that. They want to go after the tech companies because it's not radical. It's not radicalization online they want to stop, Tom. This is where I get all conspiratorial again. Do you know what they want to stop? They want to stop people like me and you talking about it. That's what they want to do.
Tommy Robinson might be a good example of what's going on there.
I knew we'd find something to disagree on, Tom.
Okay, now, I'm not a huge fan of Tommy Robinson personally.
But you can be if you want, but
I get what he's doing and I get why he's saying it. What I disagree with largely is his method. But when he was arrested, tried, jailed, and transported in less than 6 hours, every citizen of the United Kingdom, but every subject of the United Kingdom should have been terrified by that. The fact that you can be rounded up, arrested, jailed, and sent off in less than 6 hours without your lawyer even being there is terrifying. But I think why they react so bad to guys like Tommy Robinson and many others, he just happens to be the sort of noisiest example, is Tommy Robinson and many like him are an actual threat to the state, in the sense that Tommy Robinson and many others, like you and I sitting here right now, actually, are saying that the state is failing. The state is not protecting its youth. It is not protecting its borders. It is not protecting its future. And in order to defend against this, rather than solve the problems, people like Theresa May, the European Union, Angela Merkel, and a whole bunch of others instead want to shut the discussion down.
I'll tell you this, though, Tom, honestly. You see, you're an educated man and you have an opinion that's genuine. And you're a rational man, and I can talk to you. Whether I agree with you or not doesn't matter. There's a lot that you've said today that I take on board, and I agree with it, even if I don't want to agree with it, but I do. Robinson, I've known him for years. I interviewed him some years ago in Spain. Robinson, however he might try to dress himself up today as a reformed and changed character, is not. He is a genuine scumbag. Now listen, I'll tell you, Tom, I can't stand people who throw the accusation of racist at everybody just because they disagree with them. It happens too much. But Lenin, Stephen Lenin, is a bona fide dyed-in-the-wool racist. There's no doubt about it. And not only that, he's he's a lot more. I mean, this is a violent thug, and it stuns me that the guy is promoted in the way that he's promoted by the UK media. I'm stunned. While more moderate voices, like yourself, we have people like you in this country who can rationalise this and who can speak about it in a way that, we can all have a discussion like adults without melting down and screaming at one another. They'll marginalise guys like you here. You won't get an airing here, but they'll put him on the news. There's a reason for that, Tom.
That I think is the problem is our discourse, our public discussion in America, in Canada, in the United Kingdom and elsewhere has become so partisan, so divided, so bitter that, it is almost impossible in many areas to have a rational discourse on virtually anything, let alone highly sensitive subjects like rape, extremism, terrorism, immigration, migration, refugees, etc., etc. So, it is a problem.
You know what, Tom? Can I just make one more point? And then I'm going to give you, if you want 60 seconds to sum up, I'm not going to interrupt you. You're going to get the final word just before we run out of time. I've got friends in this city who, they, again, third, fourth generation. They've grown up in this country and they're Muslims. Do you know what they'll say to me? They will have listened to this with great interest. And they're not snowflakes, Tom. They don't melt down when people talk about radical Islam. They're going to say, Richie, very interested in listening to Tom. I can understand Tom's point of view. I can listen to it. But the biggest terrorists in the world, Richie, are the governments of the UK, the United States, France and Israel. You've only got to look at what's going on in Yemen right now, where weaponry given to the Saudis by the British government is killing tens and tens of thousands of people. Who's the real terrorist? That's what they'll say, Tom. Regardless of what you and I say, I'm going to give you the absolute final word on it, and I'm going to say it was a pleasure speaking with you, by the way. Go ahead, final word to you.
Well, a pleasure to be here, and it's nice to actually have rational discussion between folks who can disagree on a few issues. As for the biggest terrorists in the world, I mean, Yemen is a good example, but I didn't hear the word Iran in there. The weapons that were moved into Yemen, the folks that are causing all the trouble in Yemen are the Iranians. Yemen had actually sort of boiled down to an ongoing problem, but nothing tragic, until Iran started moving in with the intent of destabilizing Saudi Arabia. So guess what? Saudi Arabia is an ally of the West. The West jumps in, the Saudis jump in, and now Yemen is a mess. If you want to fix Yemen, get Iran out. As for the biggest terrorist thing, yeah, I mean, Western governments have done a lot of bad things. Our history is covered in blood, but we're also the people that brought you democracy, human rights, rights for women, like women can actually be people. We brought freedom of speech. We brought wealth so that folks can actually eat. So are there problems? Of course there are. But if you want to look at the biggest terrorist in the world, the biggest threat, I would say right now, the worst guy living at this moment is probably Iran's ultimate ruler, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And I would say, living or dead, it's probably Hassan al-Banna, the guy that founded the Muslim Brotherhood. Political Islam is determined to impose its belief structures on the rest of the world, Muslim or not. Second last thought, the greatest victims of radical Islam are Muslims. We tend to forget that. The 10 countries in the world that have the worst terrorist problem in terms of people getting killed are Muslim majority countries where Muslims are killing Muslims. Here's the last thought. There is a global struggle right now for the soul of Islam. Some people want to take Islam, drive it forward into the future with human rights, technology, and some sort of modernity. But the folks who are controlling most of the mosques, the school associations, and that sort of stuff are sort of a Salafist, jihadist, Wahhabist, whatever you want to call a crowd. And they want to drive us back to the year 631 sort of a thing. And unless we in the West help the modernists or help the modernizing Muslims and we support them against the Salafist Wahhabist crowd, we're going to see this global struggle continue. So what you're seeing in Manchester when the arena blows up, that is a byproduct of the struggle within Islam for the soul of Islam itself. And that, my friends, is totally a Muslim thing. You can blame America, Britain, France, Germany, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, that struggle is deeply rooted in Islamic history. And that's the one thing that's got to be fixed if we're going to have a future. On the Quiggin Report, my podcast, we've addressed a number of these things. We've looked at the Westphalian state system, etc. So, if folks want to follow up on that, I'd be more than happy to come back on your show and get into those kinds of issues. Or they can listen to the Quiggin Report and go from there. So,
sounds good.
There we go.
I'll definitely invite you back. Because I'm a man of my word, I am not going to comment on what you just said there, but I would be very much in disagreement about your characterization of Iran as a state and Iran's role in Yemen. But that's where I would disagree with you. But I'm not going to get into it because I'm a man of my word. You had the final word on it. And just to remind our listeners before Tom does go, Tom's book is Submission, The Danger of Political Islam to Canada, with a warning to America. Tom, enjoyed having you on today from Ottawa. Thanks so much for doing it.
Cheers. Thanks, Richie. It was a pleasure being here.
And look after yourself. Bye for now, Tom. Tom Quiggin, live on the line, former intelligence, I suppose you could say intelligence worker for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the UN and others. He's a broadcaster and he's an author as well. I've mentioned the book there, which you can get at Amazon.com. Look, you know that I completely disagree with his characterization of Iran and his characterization of Iran in Yemen. And of course, his characterization of, all these Muslim countries where Muslims are killing Muslims. They're not. You have Wahhabists and Salafists, whom he described accurately, but being armed, funded and trained by the intelligence agencies of Israel, the United States and this country. But he's a good guy. He's an intelligent guy. And he has his opinions, and his opinions are worth hearing. I appreciate that. I enjoy hearing from others and other points of view as well. Thanks for the tweets during that. A lot of tweets came in there. Just about at the end of the programme today. I've got a really interesting programme tomorrow. Let me just bring this up there, because I don't want to get the gentleman's name wrong. I mentioned on Sunday View yesterday a website called weathermodificationhistory.com. That's weathermodificationhistory.com. And I talked about these weather phenomena that we've seen over the years, but recently in the States, and the typhoons in the Philippines and China and the damage and the devastation, and the idea that existing weather fronts or weather systems can be accelerated, or that benign weather systems can be changed to malignant weather systems, that you can have a calm front of weather, but the technology can whip that up into a force 10 hurricane. Well, I played some interesting audio on Sunday View yesterday and weathermodificationhistory.com, and I got in touch with one of the men involved with that website. His name is Jim Lee, and he's a really interesting guy, Jim, and he's going to be on the program tomorrow talking about the history going back to the 19th century of attempts to weaponize, to modify weather patterns and weather systems. It's going to be fascinating. And I'll be joined by an old favourite of ours as well tomorrow, Paul Craig Roberts, former US Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Paul Craig Roberts joins the programme again tomorrow, drops in, does Paul. So that's about it then for the show. Really liked having Dr. Chris Busby on earlier on. And Tom Quiggin, really interesting man, Tom. Enjoyed getting his take on political and politicised Islam. I know that some of you are in vast disagreement with Tom, but there's no harm in that. Nice to get him on. Nice to put our points of view to him there. Going to leave you with some Aretha Franklin and George Michael. That will close out Monday's programme. It's flown by. I've been Richie Allen. Thanks for listening. We'll do it all again tomorrow at 5 p.m. UK time on the usual channels: Fab Radio, triggerwarning.tv, my own website, and TuneIn Radio. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. See you tomorrow. Bye.